There's a very interesting Easter egg in the first Iron Man movie from 2008, where in a brief scene, we can see a billboard on the street for an upcoming movie that seems to be called Golden Dragon, and that dragon-looking character is actually meant to be an old villain from Marvel Comics called Fang Foom, an alien dragon with ties to the Mandarin, and who's one of the oldest enemies from Iron Man's Rogues Gallery. That design from the billboard corresponds to a concept art made by artist Adi Granov, who worked on the original Iron Man films as a conceptual artist, and he also illustrated a 2008 Marvel Knights miniseries written by Jon Favreau called Iron Man Viva Las Vegas, a comic book that was actually meant to be a tie-in with the first Iron Man film. So even though its canonicity is pretty questionable, it's still a story that has ties to the MCU, and in that story, Iron Man fights against Fang Foom after he was awakened from the Yangtze River in China and has unleashed a reptile plague onto Las Vegas. And although the miniseries was abruptly cancelled, with only 2 out of the 4 planned issues being made, it's still an interesting part of the MCU's early history. And that Fang Foom design honestly looks pretty sick. It looks really cool, and I wish we could have seen it get used in the Iron Man series. And even though Fang Foom still hasn't appeared in the MCU almost 2 decades later, before 2021's Shang-Chi released, a lot of people had theorized that the dragon that appeared in the film might have been Fang Foom, but once the movie actually premiered, we found out that the dragon in the movie was actually called the Great Protector and isn't related to Fang Foom. But I do believe there's a high possibility we could see the character eventually get officially introduced into the MCU. This is only one example of a secret villain hidden in plain sight within an MCU movie, and in this video, I'd like to break down all of the Marvel villains that many people might have not realized exist within the MCU, much like I've done in other similar videos for both Batman and Spider-Man. And I actually want to thank Wolf Guy Werewolf channel for giving me the idea to make research for this video. I absolutely love reading all the comments that you guys leave, and please, if you also have an awesome idea for a video that you believe would be interesting, please share it in the comments, because I'm always open to considering more ideas. There's a lot of Easter eggs and hidden details that allude to or directly confirm the existence of a supervillain from the comics that we still haven't officially seen in a movie, but that are roaming around the shared cinematic universe, as well as other villains who were planned to be used, but that were scrapped and didn't get beyond the conceptual stage. And also characters who at first might have seemed like normal, unassuming supporting characters, but they were actually low-key adaptations of a villain from the comics. One example of a character like that was this guy. Raza was the terrorist that held Tony Stark hostage in a cave in Afghanistan, where Tony was forced to create his first Iron Man armor in order to escape. If you're familiar with Iron Man's comic book origin, then you know that when he was originally introduced in the 1960s, Tony was actually originally held hostage in Vietnam in his comic book debut, since that was the war that the USA was currently fighting at the time. And in that story, Tony Stark had been captured by a communist terrorist named Wong-Chu, who, of course, ended up serving as a basis for the character Raza from Iron Man's first live-action film. The character's first movie still took a lot of time to get made. It kinda spent years in development hell, and went through a number of drafts and iterations before the project finally got attached to Jon Favreau, with the hopes of the film launching a whole franchise of different superhero films for Marvel. And throughout all of the different potential storylines and scripts they considered, they also considered a lot of different villains throughout the many failed attempts at creating a live-action Iron Man movie. The earliest report about an Iron Man movie being attempted to be developed was in 1990, when Universal Pictures bought the rights to produce an Iron Man film, and they had Stuart Gordon attached to the project as its potential director, with many different writers working on a script, such as comic book writer Roy Thomas, who had also written stories for Iron Man in the comics, and he wrote a script where Iron Man would fight against Roxxon Industries from the comics, as well as some original villains created just for the film. After many revisions, this movie would never materialize, and later on in 1996, Iron Man's film rights were acquired by 20th Century Fox, who hired screenwriter Jeff Vintar to write an early script for the project alongside Stan Lee. And in the script, Tony Stark would be victim of an assassination attempt by the evil organization known as AIM, that would later be revealed to be under the control of MODOK. And Iron Man would also fight against some other minor villains including Chameleon, Whiplash, Virus, and Jigsaw. Despite working on the project for years, Fox would eventually sell the Iron Man rights to New Line Cinema after not making much progress with their potential film, and New Line's earliest treatment for their Iron Man movie included the Mandarin as its main antagonist, being presented as an Indonesian terrorist who was under the disguise of a rich playboy that Tony Stark was aware of. Later on, New Line would bring in David Hayter to make some rewrites, and Hayter would remove the Mandarin as the story's villain in order to use Howard Stark, Iron Man's very own father, as the main antagonist, where he would ally himself with Justin Hammer after Tony Stark decides to have Stark Industries stop developing weapons, and so Howard Stark would use the War Machine armor in order to try to kill his own son and take back control of his company. New Line, of course, wouldn't end up making their potential Iron Man movie, and the character's film rights reverted back to Marvel, where they would find huge success after finally moving forward their film with Jon Favreau at the helm, which proved to be a huge financial and critical success. And despite the final film not having any of the planned original villains that were considered for Iron Man's failed films, Obadiah Stane using the Ironmonger suit to try to kill Tony and take over his company does feel kind of similar in concept to Howard Stark using the War Machine suit to fight against Tony. Moving on to Iron Man 2, we had Justin Hammer and Whiplash as its main villains, but a fun fact about the MCU's version of Whiplash is that he uses elements from another comic book villain of Iron Man called Crimson Dynamo, an early villain from the character's stories that also uses a power armor like Iron Man, but to fight on behalf of Russia or the former Soviet Union. Whiplash in the movie is presented as a disgruntled Russian scientist that tries to take revenge on Tony Stark for how his own father was mistreated by Howard Stark decades earlier. And the father of Whiplash in the MCU was actually Anton Vanko, who was the very first Crimson Dynamo in the comics, and was adapted in the MCU as a Soviet scientist who helped Howard Stark in developing the first arc reactor, only for him to be deported to the Soviet Union later on. We can actually briefly see Anton Vanko during Iron Man 2, and he also made a full appearance in the series Agent Carter. Another very interesting Easter egg from Iron Man 2 comes from a scene in the movie where Nick Fury is showing to Tony Stark all of the different potential superhuman hazards that S.H.I.E.L.D. is keeping tabs on throughout the world. The scene actually alludes to S.H.I.E.L.D. knowing about the existence of Wakanda, since they have surveillance over an area of Africa, just like they're surveilling other heroes throughout the map. And we can also see that S.H.I.E.L.D. is observing a point in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which fans had always speculated that it was meant to be an early Easter egg for Namor the Submariner. This might have been the case originally, but after the character finally made his debut years later as the antagonist of Black Panther Wakanda Forever, we actually saw that Marvel had decided to retcon this potential Namor Easter egg from Iron Man 2, since they decided to reinvent Namor, and they renamed the ancient city of Atlantis to Telocan, named after a legendary Aztec underworld paradise, since they also reimagined the Atlanteans as having come from the North Atlantic Ocean near the Yucatan, and later reallocating to the Puerto Rico Trench, which, of course, as you can see, is nowhere near the place that was pointed out in the map in Iron Man 2. In my opinion, that scene in the movie was probably meant to be a Namor reference, but most likely, at the time, they probably hadn't decided on how they were going to adapt the character for the MCU yet. The next MCU film in the series was Iron Man 3, and since it served as a loose adaptation of the Extremis storyline from the comics, it used the same original villain, Aldrich Killian, as the movie's main antagonist. There were also a couple of minor enemies who were actually adaptations of other comic book characters. Coldblood, for example, was a lieutenant colonel from the US Army named Eric Savin, who was saved after a near-death accident by cybernetically enhancing him, which resulted in him also losing his memory and serving as a mercenary afterwards. He isn't really a full-on villain in the comics, but in Iron Man 3 he actually appeared as Aldrich Killian's right-hand man, who was one of the first people to receive the Extremis procedure to gain powers, and he even posed as the Iron Patriot in the movie. Similarly, another minor character from the movie who you might have not realized was actually a supervillain was this guy. He was the soldier that injected himself with Extremis and overdosed to the point that he exploded. The character was credited in the film as Jack Taggart, which in the comics is actually the civilian name of the supervillain Firepower, who was an army pilot assigned with testing a new advanced armored suit being developed by their government with the intention to use it in case they needed to control superheroes, and he fought Iron Man multiple times throughout his comic book history. Now, the last character from Iron Man 3 we need to talk about was the character of Hansen, who was portrayed by Rebecca Hall. And in interviews after the movie released, she revealed that when she originally signed onto the movie, her character originally was meant to have a much larger role, describing in an interview with Collider how early drafts for the movie had Maya Hansen being used as the main villain and the original creator of the Extremis Serum, who would have gone through a redemption arc by the end of the movie, where she would try to do good and help fix the damage she had done. However, this was changed because the management of Marvel and Disney at the time didn't believe that having a woman as the main villain of a superhero movie would be commercially viable, so her role ended up being greatly reduced. The movie's main villain ended up being Aldrich Killian, who described himself as the quote-unquote real Mandarin, after they misdirected the audience with Ben Kingsley's character. And ultimately, we finally saw the MCU's official real Mandarin in Shang-Chi, although it's kind of a bummer that we never got to see Iron Man fight against the Mandarin on the big screen. Moving on from the Iron Man series, now I want to talk about the Hulk, more specifically the Incredible Hulk starring Ed Norton, a movie that I've always liked personally, and I find it a shame that Marvel hasn't been able to fully take advantage of the Hulk in live action due to the complicated rights issues they have with Universal Studios, but hopefully we'll get to see a new solo Hulk movie in the future. An interesting fact about a new potential solo Hulk movie is that the Incredible Hulk's director has actually spoken in the past about his plans for a possible sequel. If you saw the film, you'd probably recall that the leader was actually set up as a future villain in the MCU. And this was in fact meant to be teasing that the character would return to fight against Bruce Banner. And not only that, but the movie's director also confirmed that he wanted to have Bruce Banner transform into the Grey Hulk, and to also have him fighting against multiple Red Hulks, which sounds interesting to say the least. And although this never happened in the end, next year in 2025, we will actually see the return of the leader and the debut of Red Hulk in Captain America: Brave New World. Continuing with the main Avengers, now let's talk about Thor. And I honestly couldn't find any secret or hidden villains in Thor 1. We saw Loki, the Destroyer, the Frost Giants, and that's about it. A fun fact about the sequel though, Thor: The Dark World, is that before they settled on Malekith and the Dark Elves as the film's main villains, they were actually considering using Hela as the villain. But much like with Maya Hansen in Iron Man 3, this decision was rejected because network executives at the time didn't think that a female character would work as the main villain of a superhero film, and Hela would still end up being used for the third film in the series. But I'm really curious to know if Hela would have still been adapted as Thor and Loki's secret sister like they did for Thor Ragnarok, since it was something they changed from the source material. In the comics, she isn't the daughter of Odin, she's actually the daughter of Loki, so maybe if Hela was adapted earlier in the MCU, they might have made an adaptation that was closer to the comics. Still though, not only did we see Hela during Thor Ragnarok, but there was actually a very interesting scene during the movie that expanded the MCU by simply confirming the existence of a handful of different characters from Marvel Comics that still haven't appeared in the live-action movies. During a brief scene set in the planet Sakaar, we can see headbutt statues of the previous gladiatorial champions next to the Grandmaster's palace, and we can see 5 characters that fans have tried to identify, and the general consensus seems to be that these are the statues of the following characters: Bybeast, an android villain that has fought the Hulk many times; the Dark Crawler, an extra-dimensional entity who was the ruler of his own dark dimension, and has regularly fought against Doctor Strange; Ares, who's the incarnation of the Greek god of war within the Marvel Universe, and a regular enemy of both Thor and Hercules in the comics. And I honestly hope he gets to officially debut in the MCU in the future, not only because he's a pretty badass villain, but also because seeing him getting ripped in half by the Sentry would be cool as hell. There's also 2 other characters that had head statues in Sakaar, but that aren't really villains, and Beta Ray Bill was another character referenced by this scene, and man, it would be awesome to see him get fully adapted in the MCU. Beta Ray Bill is one of the coolest supporting characters in Thor comics, and it would be an awesome way to further expand the MCU's cosmic side. The last character that was referenced by the Sakaar statues was Man-Thing, who prior to Thor Ragnarok had only been adapted in a failed low-budget Marvel movie that was unrelated to the MCU, and years after the character was referenced in Ragnarok, he finally made his official debut in Werewolf by Night. Now let's talk about Doctor Strange. Man, what a great movie. And who could possibly forget its amazing main villain? Kailisu. But a little known fact about the movie is that another villain from the comics was adapted as a minor character. I'm talking about this guy. He was Daniel Drumm, another member of the Masters of Mystic Arts alongside Stephen Strange. And while in the movie, this dude was portrayed as being pretty honorable and pretty much a good guy, since he seemingly died protecting the New York Sanctum against the film's villain. But in the comics, Daniel Drumm is actually the evil brother of the superhero Brother Voodoo. Their souls were bonded after Daniel died and Jericho became the new Brother Voodoo, with Daniel's ghost accompanying and helping Jericho in his career as a superhero, until Jericho later died on a mission with the Avengers, and Daniel blamed them for his brother's death, which made him start possessing other characters' bodies to try to kill the Avengers. And he has actually taken up the supervillain identities of Dr. Voodoo and Jack-O-Lantern in an alternate universe. So who knows, maybe Brother Voodoo also already exists somewhere in the larger MCU. Another interesting fun fact about 2016's Doctor Strange is that, originally, the film's director Scott Derrickson wanted to include Nightmare as the main villain of the movie, one of the oldest enemies of Doctor Strange from the comics, who is an evil fear lord that drains energy from dreaming beings. Derrickson wanted to present dreams and nightmares as another dimension that Doctor Strange would explore. This idea was rejected at the time by Marvel because executives thought that audiences would have a hard time understanding the concept of the dream dimension. So they opted to use Dormammu and Kailisius as the movie's villains instead. After the movie's release and overall critical and financial success, Scott Derrickson was initially brought on board to potentially direct a sequel. But, unfortunately, Derrickson stepped down from the project, and Marvel replaced him with director Sam Raimi due to creative differences. However, Derrickson has gone on the record providing some details about what his version of Doctor Strange 2 would have been about, describing his vision for the sequel as an extreme departure from the first film, and that it would have been a genuine horror movie. And, as you can imagine by that description, he really wanted to use Nightmare as the main villain this time. After Multiverse of Madness released, artist Ryan Da Silva posted on his website some concept art from the production of the movie, and by far the most interesting design he shared was an early concept art for how Nightmare would have looked like, with this concept portraying him as an ancient mystical being who rode on his horse from the comics, the Dreamstalker. And, allegedly, Scott Derrickson's early ideas for the film included a flashback where we would have seen the death of Doctor Strange's sister at the hands of Nightmare himself, and the basic plot of the movie would have had Strange and the Scarlet Witch teaming up to fight against Nightmare. And while none of this ended up happening, I would still really love to see Nightmare get adapted one day in a future Doctor Strange movie. The character has a lot of potential. So while Nightmare didn't end up appearing in Doctor Strange 2, there is another comic book villain that was low-key introduced into the MCU by a small inclusion of him in the movie. The film's story focused on Wanda Maximoff altering reality in order to find her lost sons by using the power of the Darkhold, an ancient, insanely powerful book of black magic, which prophesies the appearance of the Scarlet Witch. And the author of the Darkhold was an ancient elder god named Chthon, who in the comics is a powerful entity that became Earth's first master of black magic and later degenerated into a demon, eventually writing the book of spells known as the Darkhold. This piece of lore was included in the movie, where not only was he mentioned by name, but Chthon also briefly appeared as a statue on the walls of the Darkhold castle. Now I'd like to talk about Black Panther. Besides the great Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa, we all remember Michael B. Jordan's great performance as the movie's main villain, Killmonger, and also Andy Serkis's smaller role as Ulysses Klaue. But a really interesting fact about the movie was revealed by its director Ryan Coogler in an interview with Yahoo Movies, where the director described how he wanted to use Kraven the Hunter as the original villain for the film and early ideas he had for its story.
So we were into the Chris Priest run. It's pretty heavy, and there's a big scene, if you know the Chris Priest things, where Panther's fighting Kraven. you know, Kraven the Hunter. And I always love Kraven the Hunter, you know, like in almost every iteration. So it was a moment where I was like, yo, do we get, like, can I grab Kraven? And it was like, nah, you know, we don't have Kraven. You know, so, you know, but he was one that I kind of was like, oh, man.
Coogler explained that he was interested in having Black Panther fight against Kraven after being inspired by a specific storyline from the run of the character written by Christopher Priest, where both characters face off against each other. But ultimately, he said he was denied permission by Marvel and had to use other characters. And I imagine that in part, this decision was probably affected by Sony having the film rights to most of Spider-Man related characters. And speaking of Spider-Man, I'm not gonna talk about the hidden or secret villains in his MCU films, because I already made an entire video discussing just that, so you can check that out after this video if you're interested. And considering this, we can now move on and talk about the Avengers. While the villain of the first Avengers movie was always intended to be Loki, thanks to the character also being the first villain they fought in the comics and his long-standing history with the team, originally, the project's screenwriter Zach Penn has discussed in the past that he considered having other villains team up with Loki in order to fight the Avengers, with him saying in an old 2012 Comic-Con panel that he considered including Red Skull into the movie. And later on, once Joss Whedon was brought in as the Avengers director, he also felt unsure on whether Loki could carry the movie as its sole villain, so Whedon briefly considered including Ezekiel Stane, the son of Obadiah Stane from Iron Man 1, and a character that's also a villain from his rogues gallery. He considered having the second Ironmonger team up with Loki to fight against the Avengers, but this villain team-up idea was ultimately rejected, and the character of Ezekiel Stane is reportedly going to appear in the Ironheart Disney Plus series. We can find yet another interesting Easter egg during Avengers 1, in the scene that Nick Fury approaches Steve Rogers to convince him to join the Avengers Initiative, and he hands him a document containing details about the Tesseract, which was one of the Infinity Stones. And after further rewatches, fans were able to read that the document actually mentions Mephisto by name, who's an extra-dimensional demon that lives in his own pocket dimension akin to Hell. And when you zoom in on the document when it appears on screen, it's talking about the Tesseract, saying, quote, how they want to be used and deny certain wishes. Mephisto has proposed that a billion sentient universally linked will could overcome this problem, and that the cubes could be as powerful as the Infinity Gems. This implies that S.H.I.E.L.D. somehow had discussions with Mephisto about the Tesseract, and certain problems regarding its usage. However, no one from Marvel or the film's production has stated that this Mephisto name drop was actually intentional and significant to the MCU at large. And since in the document they were still referring to the Infinity Stones as Infinity Gems like in the comics, suggests that they were just playing with early ideas about the concepts, but hopefully we will get to see Mephisto fully debut in the MCU. Maybe in a new solo Ghost Rider movie, or that Midnight Suns movie. That'd be sweet. As we all know, the villain of Avengers Age of Ultron was, Ultron. But a fun fact about the movie was that Tom Hiddleston was meant to return as Loki for a brief scene, probably because of how well received the character was in the first movie. And they even shot some scenes with the character, but they decided to cut them from the movie. In an archived interview with MTV, Joss Whedon said that the scenes were cut because he felt like the movie was already too overstuffed with many different characters and diverging storylines, with Tom Hiddleston later adding that in test screenings for cuts with the movie that included his scenes, audiences were often left confused, since they gave Loki's appearance too much significance and were left with the impression that Loki was actually controlling Ultron, when in reality, his scenes were just meant to be a quick cameo just for fun. So while Loki didn't end up having a cameo in the movie, there was another subtle Easter egg to a comic book character that some people might have missed. After Tony Stark's artificial intelligence Jarvis ended up becoming Vision, he decided to replace him with a new artificial intelligence to help him while commanding his suits. And while he ultimately replaced Jarvis with an AI named Friday, one of the programs he considered was actually named Jocasta, which is a reference to the character of the same name from the comics, who was created by Ultron after desiring a bride to fulfill his need for companionship. So he decided to brainwash Hank Pym into transferring the life energies of Janet Van Dyne into an android, who would be named Jocasta and was intended to be Ultron's bride. But Jocasta actually isn't a villain. She rebelled against Ultron and went on to become an Avenger herself. But I still thought I should include her in the video since she's a cool character that's directly related to a supervillain, and she had a nice little reference in the movie. And that's about it. It was really fun researching and working on this video for the past couple months. And I actually learned a lot about different characters that I hadn't realized were already teased in the MCU, but those were all the supervillains that were referenced or subtly adapted in the MCU that I could find. You know, besides the other villains that I already talked about in the Spider-Man video. But if you by any chance know of another secret or hidden villain from any MCU show or movie, then please leave a comment below, because I'm sure there's a few things that I might have missed, and it's entirely possible that I could do a part 2 in the future. So let me know what you think in the comments, and also tell me what Marvel villains that haven't been introduced into the MCU yet would you like to see next. I don't really know if Marvel should have brought back Robert Downey Jr. to play Dr. Doom. That's kinda weird. But you know what they should have done instead? They should bring back Miles Teller as Reed Richards and turn him into the Maker. That'd be nice.